Hi, it's Ed Sutcliffe here from Met Marketing. Welcome to our first podcast. I'm delighted that Daniel Krigers from Chadwick Lawrence has joined us. He's the partner and heads up the employment law team. I think you'll all agree that in the current pandemic and all the changes that have happened within the employment sector, it's a good time to really discuss where we're at. And also with some of the announcements from the Chancellor and from the Prime Minister this week about the sort of getting people back to work. It's an opportune moment to really discuss moving things forward and getting individuals back into work. So welcome, Daniel.
Thank you, Ed. Good to be on the call.
Good. Thank you for joining us. I think it's worth mentioning that we are Wednesday, not Wednesday, it's Tuesday the 12th of May, and I think we're an hour after the latest announcement from the Chancellor, which has extended the furlough scheme further. So I'm sure there'll be some updates and news on that over the coming days. So yeah, we'll sort of certainly cover those areas and discuss. But whilst we'll look at what's kind of happened, this is really about what's next. I think we've all kind of got used to the furlough scheme, the portal's open. I think it's running relatively smoothly from what we've there's certainly not been any horror stories in the press yet about the portal, and it seems to be going okay.
It seems to be going very well. I think the aim, I don't know why the government puts out predictions as to how quickly things are going to be paid and off the ground, but it has really worked very well from the point of opening the portal to getting payments through to the employers,
which is good. So we're in week 8 of lockdown now. So how's that been going for yourself personally? How have you found it?
I think for me personally, because as an employment lawyer, we've actually probably seen an upturn in work. It's been quite good just to have something to focus on during the day, really. I mean, I haven't been exposed to the furlough scheme myself. I've kept extremely busy, and that's been quite a saviour really at this time. I've worked from home just about every day, and I'm also an NHS volunteer as well. So there's plenty that's kept us going. I think what I and most of our team now want is more light at the end of the tunnel, which from the recent announcements, it certainly seems as though we're starting to make a plan to get there now.
Yeah, and I think from our perspective, yeah, it's good that we're starting to move things along. You know, our recruitment business, we need people back in work, and really the employment world to start moving again. So yeah, as you say, hopefully things will start to move on. Obviously, it's going to be very slow, but that'll be good. And any challenges you found just from working from home in terms of yourself? How have you found it?
The diet initially.
Yeah.
That became quite horrendous, especially as I rediscovered my love for cake baking and biscuits and anything that was in the fridge, really. I suppose as a manager of a team as well, we had suddenly 13 different workplaces, which were people's homes, and getting to grips with an upturn in advising businesses, but at the same time keeping that team together and keeping them motivated during what was really busy period was quite a challenge. But you adapt, and just looking at the podcast today, for example, there are plenty of ways that we can engage with people, and I think if anything, it's taught us that we can do more of this rather than the face-to-face driving between offices. It's just not necessary going forwards.
And I think it's been interesting though, because I think when it all started out, I think everyone was like, "Oh wow, this is flexible working," but actually, I think people realise actually probably the opposite of that, and actually more restrictive. So I think there's an element that it's going to be interesting when people do go back to the office, let's say, because I think people are going to want that mix up because they want some variety. They want to be with people at some points or working from home at other times and things like that as well. So I do think it'll be an interesting cultural shift, and I think for a lot of companies they can realise that people can work from home effectively as well, which will be a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you've been with Chadwick Lawrence, I think it was around coming up 15 years. So it'd be good to get a bit of background to you, understand almost why we're talking today on this topic. So yeah, it'd be good to know a bit more about you.
Yeah. So I have my 15-year anniversary in October, all being well. I actually joined straight from college and studied part-time all the way through to qualification. So I've been an employment law advisor, qualified for around 7 years now. During that time, we've grown to advising around 250 businesses on a retainer scheme. We also advise individual clients, so both the employee and employer are represented. And that forms part of our wider commercial services, so encompassing property, corporate work, regulatory services, and some health and safety, which is part of what the next phase of the announcement focuses on now in getting workplaces back open. So I've been based across a few offices of ours across West Yorkshire, and at the moment now based permanently in Huddersfield.
And it was interesting what you said, you know, how busy you've been, and, granted for what is really the wrong reasons, but having employment really at the forefront in the news, the changes that are coming in, it again, taking the right way, it's an exciting time to be in employment law, whereas I guess normally it's seen as quite just a topic that's always there. We need it, but not the most, I say exciting in inverted commas. Sorry about that.
Well, that's exactly how I describe it, actually, because whilst it is a varied topic, employment law, I have around 50 businesses that I look after, and they're across different sectors, different sizes, different stages of ownership. But this is the first time we've picked something up that started with 4 paragraphs on a government email. Within 24 hours, we were trying to advise on 100 different questions, and then we've seen the life cycle of that initiative right through to the portal being set up, and even today's announcement on extending that scheme. So you're right, it has actually genuinely been quite exciting to pick something brand new up, interpret it, and adapt as the elements change. We're onto I think the 9th revision of the guidance was only published a couple of days ago. So that's how fast changing this has been, and it has been exciting in a sad sort of way for an employment lawyer.
And looking at the job retention scheme, the government retention scheme now, give us your take and your view on how it's been going, how we've got to this point, and your thoughts on it all.
Yeah, so I think it was probably the last week in March where the lockdown measures were announced, and immediately a significant number of businesses were thinking, well, this is the end. We're having to look at unpaid layoffs or redundancies. We need something. And I think the scheme was announced on a Friday, and it was immediately seen as a great safety net for a lot of businesses. Having seen the detail of the scheme initially, I was concerned that this only applied where the business would otherwise have been making permanent compulsory redundancies. And I think an excellent feature of the scheme is its flexibility. So in the guidance that was published, it became clear that this was an initiative that could be used where there was a disruption as a result of the pandemic. So it wasn't as serious as, the business has to be on its knees in order to be able to utilise the scheme. It's to deal with an interruption to the business as a result of the virus. So in that respect, I think it's worked incredibly well because it's created a lot of flexibility in a business's decision making. I think there's limited opportunity to abuse the scheme because of various safeguards that have been put in place by the government. But overall, I think all political parties have welcomed this. I think it's given the opportunity for perhaps just about as many people as possible to benefit from it. And I suppose my only concern is it's a great unknown for me what long-term financial effect that has on the economy, because I think as the admission was, it costs nearly as much to run the scheme in a month as it does the NHS.
Yeah, no, it is, and I think that they didn't expect. I think there was talks of maybe 9 million. I think it's more 6 to 7, which is a little bit less, but I think it's still more than they thought. And I guess from a legal standpoint, then what do you feel's gone well, and what have you been able to kind of achieve in this period?
Well, as I say at the beginning, I think the concern from businesses was, and the discussions that we were having were centred around how do I lay off my employees temporarily, and that would have caused just unbelievable damage to the economy. You know, if you talk about a quarter of the workforce suddenly on zero pay, that would have been incredibly damaging. So the benefit to the furloughing scheme is that we've got a negotiation exercise with employees, which in my experience, 95% of employees have gone with. And being on board with furloughing. So that just demonstrates the fairness and equity of the scheme which has been put in place. It's allowed people to be brought back who were laid off or who had resigned, and to benefit from an income for a certain period of time. And I think those legalities around the scheme and the provisions that have been put in place to support as many people as possible have created this success. Because, as I say, it could have been much more limited. It could have been limited to those who were facing immediate unemployment. And I think, to the government's credit, albeit it's costing a fortune for the Treasury, it has safeguarded a lot of jobs, at least for now.
And have there been sort of any particular challenges with it being such a new piece for the legal profession that they face? Has there been any challenges that you've specifically had to overcome?
Many. So 8 or 9 revisions to the guidance didn't help, and I don't know whether this was deliberate, but there seemed to be a pattern of releasing new versions of the guidance at 9 o'clock at night, which we'd then have to reshape and advise on the next day. I think one of the biggest difficulties of the scheme, and I know there's been quite a campaign from certain TV personalities to try and reverse this, but there are a number of individuals who started employment just at the beginning of March and who may not have been on their employer's payroll system until later in the month, and in most cases they're excluded from the scheme, unfortunately. And I think the only alternative for them is universal credit, which is a much lower amount of income for them. So we have to accept the scheme hasn't captured everybody, and unfortunately there are some who have been dealt quite a blow from the provisions in the scheme. But that's one of the main challenges are really adapting to the scheme and then communicating on to our clients on where they unfortunately have to tell an employee that they're not going to be included. I think the final issue has been actually calculating pay. It's been incredibly technical and I think overly complicated to decide exactly what this 80% subsidy is. You throw into the mix commission, overtime, bonuses, average pay, and the direction which has been given to HMRC to interpret all of this is, I think, unnecessarily complex. But that's probably my only real criticism of the initiative.
Yeah, because we found ourselves in a sort of couple of positions where one person had actually handed the notice in March to leave our organisation and then had the other role pulled. So actually we managed to get them back onto our payroll, and equally had another person that started with us in March who, the choices were, keep on, which we have, or they wouldn't have been going onto a furlough scheme. So we certainly experienced that ourselves, but made the decision to make sure that everybody was sort of secure and had some income, some income coming through. And now we're coming to the next phase, which is more about the sort of future and kind of getting the economy going, getting people effectively back to work. And as we mentioned earlier, we just had the announcement from the Chancellor that the scheme now runs to October. Obviously, a few changes in the scheme. So yeah, but in terms of that, what's your interpretation of kind of the next stages and where we're at now?
Yeah, well, I think it's positive. Firstly, that there has been some certainty, at least on extending the furlough scheme in some respects until October. That will be 80% capped at £2,500 at least until the end of July. And I think the intention then is, as the Chancellor has said, sharing the costs of the scheme between employer and the government, which I expect will mean an encouragement to start to bring back furloughed employees on a part-time basis, with the government possibly topping up to that 80% level. I actually expected that there would be a carve-out for certain sectors. So we should be appreciating that most hospitality, leisure and retail sector businesses are not going to open until at least, I don't know, July, maybe even August.
July time, yeah, so June the earliest, then July for the majority, in August, you say, yeah.
So I would have expected that maybe the furloughing scheme would taper off more quickly for other industries, and for those who are not able to open the doors as quickly, they would be the ones where the support would be more focused, going up to the end of October. But there seems to be a message that every sector will be treated consistently, which is quite interesting to me.
Mm. So in terms of, I guess, if we focus on employers first, then, and I guess the employers have got time to hopefully plan ahead now. So what would your advice be to employers in terms of the steps that they need to really start taking now when they're looking at their workforce and thinking about how they then now bring the workforce back into the I say the office, but it might be a physical office or it might be working from home. What do employers need to do?
So we had the big announcement on Sunday about employees being actively encouraged to come back to work now. I think the government's message maybe was lost back in March. A number of workplaces weren't forced to compulsorily close. Businesses took that decision, I think, on a safety basis and because of the furlough scheme. But now the message is shifted to being actively encouraged to come back. That creates a number of issues for employers in terms of their planning. And it's something where we're going through ourselves at Chadwick Lawrence. Whilst we have everybody comfortably working from home, we now have to plan those steps to bring people back. Now, government's provided sector-specific guidance to 8 different industries. It's very detailed, but I think it's very well put together. It's quite logical in terms of the steps, and in a number of cases, as the Prime Minister said himself, it's a lot of common sense that businesses should apply. Our thinking initially is that we really should be seeking the views of our employees. The government guidance does say that when risk assessing the return to work, you should involve workers, but what we've thought is, we've had a number of people furloughed, we've had a number of people home working. We don't actually know whether their personal circumstances have changed, so that if we do open up, are they going to be able to come back to work? Are they going to be comfortable coming back to work? Are there any barriers such as childcare? Are they living with somebody who's shielding because they're vulnerable? So our planning has started initially with a series of questions to say, look, what are your circumstances? What would you prefer? And are there any difficulties that we can overcome together in bringing you back?
So yeah, I think that's going to be a key thing, because that is the reasonable approach that we'd hope a lot of people would take. But I guess if we're following the letter of the law, is there anything that if employers are following almost a step process that they should be doing, really?
Yeah, so the questionnaire, or the questions to staff about their preferences, is really the logistical planning.
Okay.
So, what, in terms of timescales, who can we feasibly bring back? What are their requirements? What might we have to wait for to bring some people back? The sector-specific guidance really looks at physical risks to workplaces, be that in transport, factories, working in people's homes, or in our case, office space. So there's a number of areas that the business has to plan around, things like staggering working patterns and shifts to make sure that we have as space in the office, really, so not everybody in at once, because you probably won't be able to social distance. Do you need any protective equipment such as screens at reception? What do you need to communicate to visitors and third parties who are coming into the building? Do you need a one-way system? Do you need to look at hand sanitizers, educational posters across the workplace? All manner of areas, really, which are designed to maintain health and safety, so to prevent the spread of the virus through good hygiene, but also to ensure that the government's main message of social distancing is adhered to, because 2 meters is still key, and is going to be for a number of months, I think.
And I guess in the side of the employees, then again, what's the thought process on what they should be doing, and not necessarily sitting there and waiting for their employer almost? Is what can employees do?
Yes, so employees are going to be as nervous, I think, about future decisions and government guidance as employers are. And one of the things we've been stressing over recent days is the need to be adaptable and agile. Because from the employee's perspective, if you are currently working from home or furloughed, you will need to be adaptable enough to come into work on reasonable notice if the business reopens. But you also need to be adaptable to a changing situation, such as, well, actually, we can't reopen the schools for a number of weeks, as we previously planned, because of further outbreaks. And all of that, unfortunately, creates quite an uncertain position for both employee and employer. So at the present time, I, as an employee, should be thinking about how I can make a return to work once that workplace opens. And I need to think about how I can do that safely and how I can approach my employer to try and ensure that my return is as safe as possible. One of the biggest issues, maybe more in busier parts of the country, such as London, is the commute to work. So if I might be concerned about going back to work because I have to travel in rush hour and I have to use public transport. So I would be thinking now, as an employee, will my employer be offering me any flexibility in terms of staggered hours, part working from home, coming in a bit later, so if I do have to use public transport, it's not as busy. And on the other side of the coin, I as the employer should be ready to have that discussion and ready to come up with some short-term adjustments to try and facilitate that.
And I guess from the black and white contractual obligations, what, I know there's not a standard employee contract and things, but on the whole, what protections do both sides have, and where I guess almost where are the gaps as well? So what is the contractual kind of obligations on both sides at the moment?
Yeah, so the employee, well, there are implied duties in every contract of employment. So whether all of the terms are written down or not, the law implies certain duties into the contract. Now, one of those duties is on the employer to protect the health and safety of its employees. It has a duty of care to maintain that health and safety. And the second is to maintain trust and confidence in the relationship. I think if an employer is going to act in a very harsh manner and simply dictate that an employee comes back tomorrow, isn't going to communicate any measures that it's put in place, hasn't put any measures in place, then I, as the employee, do have protection there. There is a breach of my contract if my employer fails to maintain my health and safety, and if they fail to maintain the relationship of trust and confidence. Now, on the other side of the coin, we have had a few inquiries from employers who are saying, my workplace is opening up, I've put all the distancing, hygiene, safety measures in place. I've asked my employee to come back from furlough leave and they've refused without giving any particular valid reason. And in those circumstances, the answer is, well, the employer in that circumstance has protection because it has an express duty on the employee to work a certain number of hours in the week. And as long as the employer is reasonable about that return to work and takes into account any complicating factors such as childcare or shielding, then there is the power there for the employer to take action if an employee still refuses to come back. But the government guidance throughout has stressed that the furlough scheme and the guidance around returning to work doesn't change basic employment law obligations. And it also places a duty on both parties to act reasonably in reaching solutions in this unprecedented time.
So just from an employer point of view, if that point is reached where the employer thinks that they've been reasonable, they've put all the guidance in place, but the employee is still refusing to come back, would that then go into, would you recommend that goes down then a disciplinary procedure and follows their standard kind of disciplinary route, or is there another route that employers would go down?
Well, reluctantly, I think the employer would only have that option available to them because in their view, if they've done everything they can to secure a safe return and the employee is still refusing, then firstly, the employee is refusing to follow a legitimate instruction, which is to return to work. And secondly, the employee is unauthorised absent. They're not on furlough leave anymore. They're not absent by reason of illness or injury. They're simply refusing to work. And whilst I would hope that it never gets to that extent, because there is dialogue between the parties, if an employer had to, it would invoke its disciplinary procedure.
And again, from the employee's perspective, where's their sort of starting point if they have, genuine concerns? They maybe raise that with the company, but they're not met, as it were. What's the steps the employee can take?
Well, there is quite a lot of protection for employees, and I suppose it depends on the nature of the employer's conduct and any characteristics that the employee holds. So if you take the example of an employee who maybe has a serious respiratory condition, so COPD, for example, and has been advised to shield by the NHS or Public Health England for 12 weeks, if their employer dictates that they must come back to work and it's not safe for them to do so, there's potentially a breach of the employment contracts, potentially a breach of the duty to maintain the health and safety and trust and confidence. The employee may also have a disability if their illness is so significant, and that raises a question as to whether they've been treated less favourably, either because of a disability or for a reason relating to that. There's also the ability of an employee to raise a protected disclosure, so a complaint that their health and safety is being infringed, if they don't feel that the measures being put in place by the employer are sufficient enough. So there is a fair amount of protection there. From a regulatory perspective, I think the government announced yesterday that an additional £14 million, or 10% of the health and safety executive budget, was being given to allow increased spot checks within employers' premises and for enforcement purposes as well. So it is open to the employee to make a disclosure to the HSE as well if they really felt that they needed to do so to protect themselves.
And you talked about the guidance that's becoming available. Is that through the normal government kind of website, or is that the government approaching employers and who's got to be proactive in this side?
It's for employers to find, really. So on the gov.uk website, I think there's a permanent banner at the top now, which is coronavirus, what you need to know. Clicking onto that link, there's a section for employers and businesses, and that will take you to the guidance for the 8 different sectors. There's an external link to the HSE, which gives some advice on providing risk assessments. The suggestion is that employers with over 50 employees will publish their risk assessment of their workplace on the website. And there is also a suggestion that employers should print off a poster and display it across its workplaces to show that they are COVID response ready. So they've put all the measures in place that are needed to reopen the workplace safely. There's plenty of resources on there. I think there was a suggestion that might be added to this week as well. Beyond that, the recommendation from the government is also to approach your own trade bodies, trade associations, because in different industries, they may have their own regulatory body, which is also providing guidance on safe working systems.
And I think certainly from some of our clients that have been maybe more in the manufacturing sector, they're kind of, as you said, there's been a few industries like construction and stuff that are kind of have had a bit more time to get their working environments compliant. Just from what you're talking, and again, I don't know if you know this, but I guess how much time should clients and companies be taking to get compliance? It sounds it's going to be quite an in-depth process. You've got to get everything sorted, so it's not something that a lot of, as I think we were complaining about, they were told to go back to work on Monday. Well, you're not going to be able to turn around and say, "Oh, we're now compliant." Any thoughts on how long companies should be giving themselves to get compliance and safe to place to work?
It's tough. I mean, if you take an office environment, which is traditionally seen as quite low risk in terms of the risks to health and safety, I've converted that guidance into a Word document for our own operational planning, and it's 7 pages. We've got to look at over 200 employees and their working patterns, how we're going to accommodate them, where they're going to sit, the fact that they're not going to be able to hot desk, they're not going to be able to access certain areas. We have to look at the communal facilities, who is going to clean them on a regular basis, Are we going to let employees use kitchen areas? If not, how are they going to be educated in terms of what they've got to bring themselves? We've got to order supplies, and who knows how long that's going to take, especially when there is a surge in businesses who are going to be ordering things like gloves, maybe masks, protective screens. That will take time for that to arrive. And then we have the added complication of any change to measures. So the government's roadmap that was published yesterday did stress on a number of occasions that there may be changes to the guidance. We may go backwards, and we may do that in certain geographical areas if there are spikes and increases in infections. So going back to the point I made earlier, the business might put all this planning in place to reopen its office and then suddenly find that all the staff have been ordered to work from home, or the workplace has to close again because of a temporary increase in infections. Yeah. So if you then look at, for example, a retail space like a garden centre, their planning is more difficult, I think, because they have so many members of the public, the unknown. You can train your staff and notify them as much as possible about the measures you're taking, but when 80% of the people on your premises are members of the public who haven't been trained, you've suddenly got to think about the physical environment in a lot greater detail, and I think that does increase the amount of planning that has to go into this.
And I don't know if it'll be considered the same thing, but I guess if you go to a restaurant and get food poisoning, then you've got a liability against the restaurant. What happens if you go to work and you catch COVID-19 from work? Is there any thoughts on the liabilities that's going to be involved here, and the minefield that we could have there as well?
Yeah, that is one concern that's consistently raised by employers. I think in defence of that concern, it would, to me, be quite difficult, I think, to identify the causational elements, so the definite source of any illness which was contracted. Because you might say, I picked it up from the workplace, but if you've interacted with other people on your commute or in your home or on your daily exercise, for example, it's very difficult to establish to the degree necessary for a personal injury claim, for example, where you actually contracted the virus. But certainly a very significant risk of an employee who, for example, doesn't interact with anyone, just goes to work, picks up the virus, and you look at the government guidance and the business hasn't complied with any of it, you are taking a significant risk of at least the threat of litigation if somebody does contract the virus.
And so, as you mentioned, great that the furlough scheme was brought in. It's protected jobs, helped business, and done all these brilliant things. When you see the numbers, 7 or so million that are on the scheme, but then the government has also been fairly honest, think through it, saying, look, the unemployment rate is going to go up, we can't help everybody, etc., etc. So I think we've got to understand that, yes, hopefully a large percentage will be coming back off this scheme, but there will be some redundancies, and that process is going to be starting sooner or later. So again, employer-employee side, what's your take on how that process should be managed from an employer perspective first?
Yeah, I think this is one of the challenges for the end of the furlough scheme. One unintended consequence of creating this initiative is that with, in some cases 30, 40, 50% of the workplace not working, it has caused a number of employers to identify, actually, most of this work can be done with reduced numbers. And when we do return to some form of normality, that is going to cause us to look at longer term restructuring. Some businesses actually started consultation early where there were collective obligations, with the fear that the furlough scheme wasn't going to extend beyond the end of June. So some businesses have already actually started that restructuring process. And I think for employers, it's very difficult to advise them on, from a strategy perspective, when they should be starting that planning, because as we've said throughout this discussion, there are so many variables which might affect the recovery of the economy generally and the recovery of your individual business. So from an employer's perspective, I think we have a positive announcement that the furlough scheme is going to be extended. So it buys a little bit of time to identify how the next easing of measures will affect the infection rate and how that will affect lockdown, and ultimately how that affects the economy and their business. But at some point, probably mid to late summer, I think a lot of companies are going to have to sit down and say, well, actually, what is our projected profit for this year? Where's the gap? Which there is going to be a gap in many industries. How do we plug it, and how do we then look at a consultation exercise to restructure? And from an employee's perspective, it's difficult to provide specific advice on what to do at this stage, because they're in the hands of the employer to make a decision on whether they restructure and what that's going to look like. I think for employees who are continuing to work, so those who aren't furloughed, their position is that day by day they're continuing to demonstrate value because their workload may well have increased as a result of the furloughing. For those that are off work, it's a very difficult position to be in, because the immediate future is very uncertain. Am I going to be furloughed until the end of October now? And beyond that, when the furloughing scheme ends, will I still have a role to come back to? And it's a really difficult position for those guys to be in.
But I guess in terms of from a legal perspective and from both sides, actually the redundancy process that would have happened last year to the redundancy process this time is the same. There's no real change to that. It's just happened that the employee this needs to be maybe even done remotely or whatever, but actually from an employment law perspective, you don't necessarily see any changes in the process needed.
No, I mean, the scheme has explicitly, the scheme guidance has explicitly stated that redundancies can be carried out following closure of the scheme. That's just subject to normal employment law principles. So an individual consultation exercise needs to take place over a period of a few weeks. If there are more than 20, a more detailed collective consultation exercise needs to be handled. And that does allow time for meaningful discussions to take place about redundancy, possibly even to identify some alternatives. For example, people deciding to move down to part-time hours so that the number of redundancies is reduced. But yeah, I think the intention in a lot of cases with the job retention scheme was to delay that need to restructure. That there is an understanding that unemployment is going to rise, by the end of this year, and probably quite significantly. But an optimistic analyst would say that next year, hopefully, we return to growth, and there are opportunities to get back into the labour market at that point. Yeah, I think most businesses are probably looking at mid to late summer to look at some form of consultation exercise, and employees will have the opportunity to participate in a full consultation exercise before that ends.
So in terms of yourself and I guess the legality and the legal profession itself, how prepared is the legal profession to manage this next phase and the possibilities of what may come out of people returning to work or not, as the case may be?
Well, I think the planning in our business started before the first lockdown measures were announced. So we realised that if we had any missing IT provision, for example, we needed to plug that gap very quickly, because whilst a number of our staff were quite proficient working from home already, support staff, for example, and our reception function couldn't just switch to working from home without any planning. So that was the initial stage. We then had to get everybody working from home as quickly as possible, and then had to obviously react to the job retention scheme. I think, touch wood, we've sort of been fairly calm since that point in terms of the IT infrastructure has been very solid. The way in which we communicate has changed very significantly, but for the better. We've very rarely used any video conferencing previously, and I think most of us have got to grips with that now. So in terms of how prepared we are going forwards, the world of delivering legal services, I think, will change, but will change for the better, with more flexibility in terms of how it's delivered. So that can be done over the phone, video conferencing, face-to-face if needed, but really at the legal user's request, how they best want us to deliver that service. And I think us and other multi-service firms will just have to be adaptable, I use that word again, to the different pace in which the work comes back. Because whilst I say we're extremely busy in employment law, we have 12 different service offerings within the practice, and each one is affected in their own way by the pandemic. So it may take longer for the property market to recover than for corporate transactions to come back, for example. And we and other solicitors' practices have to be ready to adapt, ready to be flexible to meet what might be quite significant changes in demand from time to time.
And I know, again, from both family and dealing with lawyers myself, about, I guess, the case law and the precedents that's often needed. So again, in terms of what you guys are looking to when you're when cases are going to come in or things are going to turn up, do you have that to kind of reference point, or is it all going to be quite new and when these things happen, or is it just going to be, you've seen it similarly, it just happens that this is in a pandemic? Is there anything to look to?
Well, in an employment law context, it's interesting. It's interesting what case law might materialise and what legal arguments might materialise. So, for example, we've had some commentary suggesting that bringing some employees back in preference to others from furlough leave could amount to discrimination. I didn't even know the word furlough existed until 3 months ago. So there's completely novel arguments that are untested as yet.
Is it an American word? I feel like it feels like quite an American word.
Yeah. First thing I did was Google the word furlough when the Chancellor announced it, and it's been a fairly well established term for a temporary leave of absence in America.
Oh, okay.
But that didn't really help me understand the new scheme. But there may be breach of contract claims if people feel they've been underpaid during the furlough scheme. And then, of course, we have a period of time where HMRC may be looking into previous payments as well. So, there are likely to be new legal arguments coming out of this. And again, I suppose we just have to react to those.
Well, just to sort of kind of end and kind of wrap up on what we've discussed, and hopefully people are going to take some really useful tips, hints, points away from this. So if you're an employer watching this, what would be just your top tips for them to take away and really kind of use from our discussion today?
Yeah. Okay. So firstly, from a logistical perspective, what does a return to work look like for us? So who might we need to bring back, and when might we need to do that? And again, might need to be fairly flexible in terms of your thinking in that respect. How do we manage that return? So understanding your employees, their needs, their particular circumstances, and how they might change. What measures you can put in place to secure a return to work? So opening up the flexibility argument again. Can we be flexible in terms of working hours, times, staggered shifts, bringing set numbers of people back in clusters to avoid contact with others? What social distancing measures can we put in place? We can't get away from the 2 metre rule. So physically within workspaces, how do we make them safe and protect our employees? What hygiene measures can we put in place? And that opens up a real need to ensure that your supply chain is spot on there, because I think there will be a surge in demand for hand sanitizers, masks, cleaning products, that sort of thing. Do we need any longer term restructuring? So we've touched on potential redundancies. We might look at that. We might look at just amending the way that we deliver our services if things like video conferencing can be sustained going forwards. And one thing we've not touched on, do we need any other business support? So there are a number of other initiatives such as loans and grants and facilities available for businesses to look to, and it may be that you have to revisit those schemes and options as we start to exit lockdown measures further.
And again, similarly for employees, what would you be your sort of top recommendations for them?
So for employees, I would be wanting to be educated by my employer as much as possible on the measures that are going to be put in place on the return to work. So I, as an employee, want to be satisfied that I'm coming back into a safe workplace. I would want to give my own input onto the matter as well. So, aside from health and safety, how would I like to be managed going back to work? Do I want to carry on working from home, or do I really miss the interaction with my team? I want to understand how that's going to look when I come back into the workplace, so that, hopefully I won't be isolated in a room on my own, and hopefully I can hit the ground running when I do come back. And I think just understanding more about the future of my employer's business as far as I can is going to give a lot of people comfort. So one of the key aspects which is often overlooked is communication and dialogue. So an employer might have the best laid plans in the world, it might have the most detailed risk assessment. If it's not involving employees in its decision making and in its planning, and it's not communicating those measures, it's going to be of limited use to employees, and they're not going to feel engaged. So as much as an employer should be communicating, I think an employee should be knocking on the door as well and saying, can you give me an update on plans on the future, and can I help in any way to contribute into my return?
I think there is that whole being reasonable through the process, because no one's done this before. Everyone, yes, there's things we can kind of look to and copy, but yeah, no one's done it before. You just got to, I think, on both sides, have to be reasonable. You mentioned the Zoom meeting. Hopefully, people have got both the audio. A bit of the picture was a little bit fuzzy in the second half, so hopefully at least your words were good. So thank you for that. But no, really appreciate your time today. We hope everybody's got a lot from today. I guess day by day there will be changes, so keep an eye on both our LinkedIn pages, Daniel's LinkedIn, and obviously the government websites will give you all the information that you need. And yeah, thanks for your time today, Daniel. Really appreciate it.
Great to talk. Thanks, Ed.